Gaius Memmius, Praetor 58 BCE. Growing up, Gaius Memmius had a burning desire to achieve the consulship, an office to which his great-uncle was elected but never got to serve. Memmius was thus a driven man, and he energetically applied himself to the political life. Sadly, his reach exceeded his grasp, and this contributed in no small part to the rocky nature of Memmius's career, which saw him become famous, above all else, for engineering an election rigging scheme which failed, and this sullied his reputation at a time when he was a strong and serious contender for the consulship. At the outset of his career, Memmius picked up where his murdered great-uncle left off, being accepted into the Sullan order by virtue of his family's allegiance to Pompey. Lucius Licinius Lucullus, the other of Sulla's two golden boys, arranged for Sulla's daughter Fausta to marry none other than Gaius Memmius. This was the best marriage match available in all of Rome, although it would not lead to domestic bliss, as both Memmius and Fausta were serial adulterers. Memmius would later reward the Lucullus brothers for their thoughtfulness in the mid-60s by becoming an ardent backer of everything that Pompey did and taking them to court over petty grievances. Failing to prosecute Marcus Lucullus, Memmius instead seduced his wife, and thus began the most successful endeavor of Memmius's life, that is, seducing the wives of his colleagues. Abandoning Pompey when the first Triumvirate formed, Memmius became one of the first senators to speak out and become associated with the opposition. Alongside of Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, Memmius secured a praetorship in 58 and thus became an empowered office-holding enemy of the triumvirs. There is a strong possibility that Memmius was actually the first to articulate the position that Caesar must stand trial for his actions as consul in 59, a position which eventually contributed to the fall of the Republic a decade later, when the Optimates were unwilling to let that point go. After an abortive attempt to prosecute Caesar and Publius Vatinius, Memmius moved on to govern Bithynia, before returning to Rome so that he could make his preparations to run for consul in 53. In the summer of 54, election season was heating up, and Memmius found himself in a four-way deadlock. Going into the election, Memmius was able to reconcile with Caesar, and this meant that Caesar's money and the votes of his soldiers were now on the table. This gave Memmius a slight edge over his peers, but he was not content. He decided to form a second alliance with one of his other rivals, this time strictly in private. That in itself would be enough to anger his public ally and backer Caesar, but Memmius compounded the problem and created the Watergate of his era. Memmius promised lavish rewards to the two current consuls, whether he won or lost, if they would do everything in their power to tip the scales in his favor. Naturally, Memmius decided to commit this shameful pact to paper. Rumors of this agreement quickly spread through the city, leading to discontent and a major delay in holding the consular elections. Confronted by Pompey, Memmius agreed to address the Senate in the fall and reveal all of the sordid details of his electoral scheme. Rome was outraged, and the Senate's credibility took a tremendous blow, even in an era when very few people had high expectations. In fact, confidence in the Roman system was shaken so severely that the consular election was ultimately delayed for an entire year. Perhaps not surprisingly, Memmius was not elected consul in the summer of 53. Not only had he failed to attain an office for which he had once been a frontrunner, but he was now a persona non grata, devoid of allies and liable to prosecution for bribery, a crime to which he had confessed before the entire Senate. After a failed attempt to claim immunity by prosecuting another guilty party, Memmius opted for voluntary exile. Moving to Athens, Memmius tried to leverage his friendship with the late philosopher Lucretius in order to insinuate himself into the affairs of the Epicurean school. He created another small international scandal, however, when he proposed demolishing Epicurus's old house, which he owned, so that he could replace it with something more to his own taste. However, public pressure in the end caused Memmius to drop the issue and move somewhere else. After his move away from Athens, we hear no more of Gaius Memmius. Not only will we delve into the twists and turns of Memmius's political dealings, but we will also look at how his infamous electoral scandal destabilized the First Triumvirate. I will do nothing less than propose that this disgraced, unsuccessful consular candidate was one of the most important architects of the Republic's downfall, in spite of the obscurity of the name Gaius Memmius today, for both students and scholars alike. Gens Memmius was far from the first family in Rome. However, they certainly weren't the least either. This plebeian gens had entered the Roman Senate around the time of the Second Punic War, and despite the fact that they had not yet produced a consul, members of the family had still had an impact on Roman politics. For instance, a man named Memmius held the distinction of introducing a festival honoring the grain goddess Ceres to the Roman calendar. Ceres, of course, to the Greeks was known as Demeter. Men bearing the name Memmius had also served as envoys in Egypt and Judea, and these missions had been recorded in historical writings. So, the name Memmius was not entirely unknown. By the late Republic, men bearing the name Memmius had developed a certain reputation for being active and willing participants in politics, but not necessarily the most skilled orators. And for Roman people, oratory was a major form of entertainment, so they were rather judgmental when it came to people's speaking abilities. But aside from the lackluster speeches given by men named Memmius, there weren't any real handicaps to bearing the name. So it was a name that didn't necessarily inspire people, but also a name that didn't turn people away. The most accomplished member of the family, when Gaius Memmius was born, was his now deceased great-uncle, Gaius Memmius Mordax, who actually had been elected consul in 100, or 400, meaning that he was elected in 101. However, Memmius Mordax would never get to assume the consulship, and that's because he was murdered by a mob led by Saturninus and Glaucia. Saturninus was an infamous tribune, Glaucia was a praetor, and they were allies of the multi-time consul at the time, Gaius Marius. However, once their mob killed Memmius Mordax, the Senate demanded that Marius turn on his allies and pass the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, and so he did. So, growing up, Gaius Memmius was aware that it was because of his great-uncle's death that Gaius Marius had had his fall from grace, and that the infamous Saturninus, perhaps the best known of the many troublesome tribunes in Rome's history outside of the Gracchi brothers, that it was because of his great-uncle's death that all of these events had transpired, and the stage was set for the rivalry and the social war between Marius, who's trying to make a comeback, and Sulla. So even though the name Memmius didn't have the greatest resonance, a figure as seemingly minor as Memmius Mordax had been at the center of a number of the developments of the 90s and even into the 80s because of his untimely demise. So this would be something that young Gaius Memmius growing up would be keenly aware of. Gens Memmius, while it wasn't huge, was big enough that there were other men running around in Rome named Gaius Memmius who were distant cousins. One of them, the tribune of 111 named Gaius Memmius, had a son with the same name, who then went on to marry Pompey's sister. And this Gaius Memmius would die in action in Spain, fighting against Sertorius in 75. If we want to trace the direct line of descent of our Gaius Memmius, however, we need to go back to Memmius Mordax and his younger brother Lucius, who was the grandfather of our Gaius Memmius. So, this line of the family, is worth mentioning, will also side with Pompey. So Pompey will be a huge influence on Memmius as a young man because his entire family, from the distant cousins to his more immediate relatives, they've all placed their faith in Pompey by the time that our Gaius Memmius is born. Gaius's grandfather was Lucius, younger brother of Memmius Mordax. He had been a moneyer back in 106, and he had produced coins with Venus to try to claim that the family had Trojan ancestry. Now, normally, the families claiming Trojan ancestry or claiming Venus were patrician families, but apparently by 106, the Trojan myth in Rome had gotten strong enough that even more humble plebeian families like Gens Memmius could get in on the action. In 87, the two sons of Lucius Memmius, Lucius and Gaius, served together as moneyers, so more coins were produced with the name Memmius on them. And in fact, despite the fact that in this particular line, Lucius tended to be the eldest son's name, or at least had been for that one generation, Gaius will be born as the son of that Lucius, and it appears he's probably the eldest son, or if not, then he had an older brother who didn't survive or make it in the politics. At any rate, though, sometimes our Gaius Memmius is mistakenly called Geminus, which means twin, but it appears, so far as we can tell, that he didn't have a twin, unless perhaps he did have a twin who was named Lucius, but let's not speculate too much. The point is, Gaius Memmius didn't really have that many eminent relatives aside from his great uncle, and all of them were aligned with Pompey by the time that he came into the world. Memmius did not eclipse his relatives in terms of pure ability. However, he very much eclipsed them in terms of his ambition, which was boundless. Not only did he dream of becoming the consul that his great uncle had almost been, but he also wanted to be a literary giant as well. And so, as had become standard in Rome, he not only wanted to be abreast of the latest and greatest in literature, but he wanted to be one of the people producing the great literature of his time. And in this way, he was a bit more old-fashioned than some of his contemporaries like Cicero. Cicero knew that it was becoming increasingly acceptable to write in Latin for a Roman audience. But the more traditional view is that culture was in the Greek language. And so Memmius seems to have been stuck in that mold, and apparently he loved Greek letters so much that he put all of his effort into learning Greek as well as possible. And Cicero tells us that because of that, Memmius was not as polished in Latin as he should have been, and he was not as familiar with some of the things that you could do in Latin to be more eloquent and smooth out your writing. Memmius's chosen field was poetry, specifically erotic poetry. As we'll learn later, he was a well-known seducer, and so his poems were celebrating his own sexual conquest. That being said, while these poems were preserved for many years, including up to the 5th century CE, he was always seen as a somewhat second-rate writer. He was still studied, so he wasn't that bad, but he was not the best at what he did. He was not Ovid. So, Memmius again had some talent, but was maybe not as good as he thought he was. Another aspect of Memmius's culture was that he was a good friend of Titus Lucretius Carus, an Epicurean poet and philosopher who wrote De Rerum Natura, or On the Nature of Things. Lucretius was a bit older, but the two of them became good friends because Lucretius needed a patron. And so Memmius gave him money to do his writing, and in return, Lucretius dedicated his famous De Rerum Natura to Gaius Memmius. So Memmius is mentioned in perhaps the greatest work of Roman philosophy, as the man who helped inspire it and make it possible. And so, while he was not a man of surpassing literary genius, he did have some talent. His poems were okay, and he did help Lucretius make De Rerum Natura a realized and published project. So Memmius is significant in the realm of culture, even if he perhaps overestimated his own contributions. Memmius was thus born, more or less, as an ally of Pompey, and he took the position he was born with and turned it into just rank partisan harassment, as we talked about earlier with his prosecution of the Lucoli. Not only did he try to prevent Lucius Lucullus from celebrating a triumph, but he then slept with Marcus's wife. So he had become a pure partisan hack for Pompey. And then he's going to do something very unexpected. So one would think that as someone who was an outright cheerleader for Pompey, that he would herald the Triumvirate as a triumph, because this would enable Pompey to pass all the legislation that he had been asking for years. But instead, Memmius went the opposite direction and became a vehement opponent of the Triumvirate. So it appears that he was outraged by the very concept of the Triumvirate, which was effectively a fixing of the Roman political system to favor the interests of a few men. And of course, there's a bit of irony there, given what Memmius will become known for later. The other thing that he really was turned off by, of course, though, was that Caesar had employed strong-arm tactics. So as consul, Caesar had been willing to bully his colleague Bibulus into not leaving his house. And so this turned off Memmius and caused him to do a 180 spin in his politics. Going into 58, opposition was mounting to the Triumvirate, but for the most part, they were still completely dominant. The two men who would succeed Caesar as consuls were both advocates of the Triumvirate, including Aulus Gabinius, who had been one of Pompey's most trusted lieutenants earlier. However, of the 8 praetors who were elected, 2 of them were hostile to the Triumvirate. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, a future consul, was elected praetor, and Gaius Memmius was too. And it probably came as a shock to a lot of people that Memmius went from being Pompey's biggest fan to being his biggest detractor. But nonetheless, this was enough to get him elected, and they were joined in the We Hate the Triumvirate fan club by the tribune Lucius Antistius. So Memmius was among the very first to not only express his disdain for the Triumvirate, but to be elected to office and to try to do something about the perceived issue. As soon as he took office as praetor, Gaius Memmius immediately demanded that the Senate hold an inquiry into the legality of Caesar's laws. After all, Caesar had passed all of his laws over the stated opposition of his consular colleague Bibulus. Bibulus had claimed that there were omens that meant the gods were not in favor of public business being conducted. And so Caesar engaged with him at first in the hopes of defeating him quickly. And for 3 days there were debates, all of which were centered around just one of the many things Caesar had passed, his land law. Caesar eventually realized that these proceedings would either take a ridiculous amount of time and potentially cost him his proconsulship, or perhaps he was fearful of the outcome and felt that this would create legal difficulties that he wouldn't be able to extricate himself from. And so he decided to give up on Memmius's hearings and go assume his proconsular command. And under a law named the Lex Memmia, clearly something passed by an ancestor of Memmius, the rule was that if you are an active official with imperium, you are not liable to prosecution until you lay aside that imperium. And so Memmius will now take the stance that you must prosecute Caesar at some point for his crimes. And of course, he was prevented from doing this in a more timely fashion by a law passed by an ancestor. So there is a bit of irony at play here. Memmius will also attempt to go after Caesar's tribune at the time, Publius Bithynius. However, this proceeding will be broken up by Clodius's gang, which was a new factor in Roman politics. So Memmius will be forced to disband his court, and Bithynius, after that point, by the way, because the proceedings had gone on so long, he appears to have largely been forgotten by Caesar's enemies. So there were no further legal actions against Bithynius, despite him still being an active politician for the rest of the 50s. Now, Memmius seems to have been the very first person in Rome to demand hearings and then to take the stance that at some point Caesar had to be prosecuted. And this now made him something of a star among those who hated the Triumvirate. So despite having been an ardent backer of Pompey just a few years earlier, Memmius was now completely on the other side, and in some ways he was one of the preeminent figures in that group. So it was a 180 that had landed. And so Memmius had a new political home, and he was one of the most prominent men within that faction. During his time as one of Caesar's chief detractors in 59 and 58, Memmius had become very fond of the old rumor that Caesar had engaged in a sexual encounter with King Nicomedes of Bithynia back when Caesar was a young envoy. And it also appears that he actually was the originator of the jibe that Caesar was thus the Queen of Bithynia. And another piece of irony, Memmius as Praetor would govern the new Roman province of Bithynia. So after Nicomedes' death, the Romans had annexed Bithynia. And now it would be Memmius' turn to be the Queen of Bithynia, at least for a year. When he went on his propraetorship, he was accompanied by the famous poet Gaius Valerius Catullus. Interestingly enough, Catullus will claim that Memmius' conduct was perverted, but when he specified what he was miffed about when it came to his time in Bithynia, he said that he didn't have a good chance to make profit or acquire any good slaves. And this could imply that in fact Memmius' government was relatively clean, and that actually Catullus' complaint is that it wasn't corrupt enough, because by this point many Romans who went off to govern a province or help a friend govern a province were there simply to make money, and they had no interest whatsoever in good government. Perhaps Memmius actually did. So despite some of the things we know about him, it's possible that he was in fact someone who was an advocate of clean government. At any rate, though, we'll never quite know. But it is always worth noting that when you have someone claiming that someone else is corrupt or what have you, that's not always necessarily an indication that the person making the accusation is any better, especially in Rome when it came to governing provinces. By July of 54, the election for the consulship of 53 was well underway, and it had shaped up into one of the most competitive races in recent memory. In fact, Cicero, who was in Rome at the time and was quite excited about this election as it was unfolding, said that all four candidates, Memmius, Marcus Valerius Messala Rufus, Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus, and Marcus Aemilius Scaurus were all just about equally matched, and he could imagine any two of those men going on to win. So it was anyone's race. All four candidates were about equally strong. Now, none of them were real standouts, but none of them were slackers either. So these are all four very sort of average strength candidates. Caesar decided ultimately that his two picks were going to be Memmius and Domitius Calvus. And Memmius might come as a surprise given Caesar's previous history with Memmius. However, Caesar realized that he could use an energetic ally. So if he could turn someone who had been a dedicated detractor into a proponent of his, this would be a huge win. And it also would give him a leg up on Pompey, who at this time was backing different candidates. As for Memmius, he was willing to cut this deal with Caesar because Caesar was his best bet. Pompey apparently wanted nothing to do with him at this point, and Caesar was able to provide votes and a lot of money. Now, Memmius was still worried, though, despite having the backing of Caesar, which was an unexpected coup, and probably made him almost a shoo-in for at least one of the two spots. He decided that things were still a little dangerous, because Pompey was backing Scaurus, and Scaurus had probably the most name recognition just based on his ancestry. and a lot of times that was enough to decide things. And with things so close, he couldn't take that risk. So what was Memmius to do but try to tilt the odds a little bit in his favor? And what a doozy of a scheme he came up with to do just that. For Memmius to reconcile with Caesar was a brilliant political maneuver, and this was something that made him, I would say, at least slightly favored over all of his competitors. In public, he also had a different alliance than what his sort of alliance with Caesar already sort of committed him to. So in public, he was appearing with Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, who, as I mentioned earlier, had the most name recognition due to his father's fame. So Caesar was okay with Memmius being aligned with a man that he didn't necessarily want, because, again, his other choice was Domitius Calvinus. So Memmius was already playing a bit of a double game, and there's nothing that would make me think that this is unusual in Roman politics at this time. However, Memmius couldn't leave well enough alone, and he decided to overcomplicate things in a way that would be embarrassing and damaging for literally everyone involved. What he did was he decided to go to the current consuls, Appius Claudius Pulcher and Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, and he proposed that if they were willing to help him, if they were willing to put their thumb on the scales in his favor when they were overseeing the elections, that he and his secret ally Domitius Calvinus, and yes, he's keeping this secret from Caesar. Caesar wanted Memmius and Domitius Calvinus, and Memmius forms a secret alliance with Domitius Calvinus, but keeps it secret from Caesar, who would have liked that. I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. The proposal that Memmius and Domitius Calvinus offer to the current consuls is that if they win, then the new incoming consuls will make sure that both of them secure really posh proconsular commands that will enable them to enrich themselves and win glory, or if they lose, then they will commit to pay them a handsome sum of money, about 3 million sesterces. And so, this was one hell of an offer. This was a massive bribe. And this would have been, of course, a tempting offer. Both men accepted pretty readily. And in order to make sure that Memmius was on the hook for the money in case he lost, they actually had a written contract whereby Memmius was now legally bound to carry out this deed. And what's really odd about the written contract is that this was in very clear violation of election law at the time. There was a law about electoral bribery, and this was as clear a contravention of that law as you can possibly imagine. Another part of the plan, which was also deeply illegal, was that they were going to distribute 10 million sesterces to the first voting century to make sure that the wealthiest citizens in Rome set the tone by voting for Memmius and Domitius Calvinus. So this was an excessively complex and completely illegal plan. Perhaps Memmius was thinking that he was being extremely clever by making this thing completely out of reach for his opponents, and also by helping someone who was aligned with Pompey. So not only was he back in good with Caesar, but he could potentially reconcile with Pompey as well. So to be fair to Memmius, had this plan actually worked somehow, and had the rumors of it not leaked out, then he would have been very well positioned as a senior servant of the Triumvirate. A position, I have to remind you, that he would have been in had he simply stuck with Pompey as a partisan hack all the way through. But nonetheless, he's figured out a way back in. Let's see how and why this unwinds horribly. If you ever study ancient espionage, one thing that you will quickly learn is that aristocratic males were incredibly unobservant and arrogant. They tended to regard people who were not aristocratic, who were not free, and were not male, as more or less incapable of overhearing things and then selling that information. In fact, the most effective spies were always lower class people, and especially lower class women, who tended to be simply ignored. Most likely, while they were hashing out this gentleman's agreement, there were people pouring them wine. And it never occurred to Memmius or his cohorts that these people might realize this information was extremely valuable and go sell it. And that's almost certainly how word leaked out, since obviously the principal players would not want this to be known. And so rumors began to swirl all around the city, to the point that there was so much discontent and fear of violence that the elections were postponed all the way to September. And that in itself was not a huge problem necessarily, because again, the consuls are elected in July and don't take office until January. So just having a delay from September to January was not necessarily something that would disrupt life. However, it's unclear exactly why they decided to push back the elections when these rumors were just getting worse and worse. It's possible that this delay was being pushed by Caesar and Pompey because they wanted to get Caesar's men into winter quarters where some of them could then take leave and go to Rome to vote for their preferred candidates. But again, that's a little bit conspiratorial. Most likely it's just because of public discontent. And apparently Caesar had ways of getting men to the elections even when he was in the middle of his campaigning season. Most likely that's because legions often had wounded or sick men. At any rate, there was so much bribe money being raised that the interest rate went up. So moneylenders had given so much money to Memmius and his cohorts that they could now charge exorbitant rates of interest to just regular lenders. And when they were asked why the damn interest rate was so high, some of these moneylenders probably let it slip out that politicians were taking out massive loans to bribe the electorate. And so the interest rate doubled from 4% to 8%. And that in itself was causing economic distress and causing people to be upset just on its own. Now, Pompey will eventually learn about this himself, and he will go and confront Memmius about the pact. And it's unclear whether he approached him as a false friend and said that if he just reveals all this, all will be forgiven and all will be set right, or whether he simply went to Memmius and threatened him with violence if he didn't go and confess. At any rate, somehow Pompey was able to convince Memmius to address the Senate and reveal all the sordid details of his compact with the reigning consuls and with his fellow candidate, Domitius Calvinus. Memmius addressed the Senate in either August or September of 54. The election was still set to go off at some point in September. And in his speech to the Senate, Memmius laid out all of the details. And when I say all of the details, I mean that he even produced the written contract that he had with the current consuls, and he shared the details of that contract with the Senate. At this point, I would love to know exactly what Memmius thought he was going to accomplish with this, because all he got out of this was that Caesar became deeply disgusted with him and would never deal with him again. Caesar, of course, hated to be made to look like a fool, and Memmius revealed that he had played Caesar. He also earned the distrust of Calvinus, who refused to ever speak to him again. And all he got out of this was pure disgrace. So he lost the allies he had just made. He also lost the trust of older allies who felt betrayed that he was doing all this stuff behind their backs. And there were some serious ramifications. All four of the candidates were investigated. And what was revealed is that all four of them had been doing greasy stuff. So it wasn't just Memmius. Memmius may have been the most egregiously guilty, but his opponents were all doing similar things. So this was a corrupt election all the way through. There were no clean hands, and also the two reigning consuls were extremely guilty of taking bribes, and Caesar and Pompey were giving money and support to these corrupt candidates. So this very much damaged public trust in the entire Senate. No one believed that the Senate was operating in good faith. And we have to remember, too, that up to this point, Memmius has been someone who has opposed the supposed corruption of the Triumvirate. So now his credibility has been destroyed, and also the credibility of his many allies is being called into question because it seems that their supposed integrity is just a front and not something that's based in reality. So Memmius' revelations did destroy himself, but he also did a great deal of damage to everyone around him. And indeed, the damage was so deep and the corruption so widespread that there were no trials that year. Obviously, a lot of people were guilty of breaking election laws, but again, who do you start with, and where does it end? You can't really go after people because usually laws like this are designed to go after malefactors. But if everyone is breaking the law, then the law becomes largely meaningless. And at any rate, the tribunes were tasked with protecting these candidates because they knew that this would start a tidal wave they couldn't control. And also, these tribunes one day wanted to go on to run their own corrupt elections for high office. So this turned into a massive scandal, which completely undermined political effectiveness in Rome. The fallout of Memmius's scandal was quite severe and widespread. Along with the death of Julia, Caesar's daughter, who had been married to Pompey, this began to really undermine the relationship between the two most important of the triumvirs. Not too long after this, of course, Crassus will now go off to Parthia and get himself killed. During this particular crisis, he wasn't that active because he was already planning for his Parthian campaign. But between the death of Crassus, the death of Julia, and then the Memmius scandal, where Pompey and Caesar each learned that the other had designs that they weren't sharing mutually, this helped to kind of undermine the trust between them. And again, no one came out looking good except for one man. And that one person who gained from Memmius's downfall was Cato the Younger. And the reason that he gained is because his reputation for probity and for being very stiff about not breaking rules that everyone else broke pretty openly, that helped him out big time. Because in order to make sure that they were above suspicion, the men running for tribune decided to make Cato the referee for the election. And so they all entrusted money with him that he would repay if he judged that they were innocent of bribery. And with one exception, he did pay back the money. One person, he said, was guilty of something. So this would help Cato to rise to be a more prominent member of the Optimates, although I would argue he never rose to the top of that faction simply because he never quite had the rank since he never reached the consulship. But the only reason he was ever really considered a key leader is because of the rise he experiences after the Memmius scandal. As for this election cycle, it will not resolve until a year after it was supposed to happen. So January came, there were no new consuls, and without consuls you can't have a Praetorian election. So Rome was without both consuls and praetors for 6 months. And then in July, finally, Pompey more or less forced the issue and said there needed to be a special election. The same 4 candidates that everybody thoroughly hated by this point and had been exposed to for over a year were still the candidates. The 2 men who won were Domitius Calvinus, the secret partner of Memmius, and then Messala, who was probably the most obscure of the candidates. And Cicero tells us that those 2 men, ironically enough, were probably more guilty of bribery than even Memmius and Aemilius Scaurus. So at a certain point, the damage was so severe from the scandal that voters simply went with who bribed them the most. And when the election became literally a very open case of bribery, the biggest bribers won. And one can imagine how this very much undermined people's belief in the idea that the Republic represented some sort of ideal government or some sort of ideal that was worth defending on any level. Gaius Memmius now found himself in an entirely unfavorable position. He now had no more friends or allies, no one trusted him, and no one would come to his aid if he were in a difficult spot. His first move was to prosecute Domitius Calvinus in connection with Domitius Calvinus's role in the election-fixing scheme. Of course, Memmius's case almost certainly was that Domitius Calvinus was the real big bad of the scandal because he had been among the winners. So therefore, he must have been the mastermind behind the whole thing. However, because Memmius's name was more attached than any other name, no one bought this, and Domitius Calvinus was acquitted. Now, given the norms of Roman law, where you can't be prosecuted while you're in office, Domitius Calvinus had just been elected consul, and so this trial would date to early 52. Shortly after this, a new law passed, and this one was designed specifically for men exactly in Memmius's predicament. One thing about Roman law that's different than American law is that you can pass a new law and then convict people for past crimes before the law existed. And so, Pompey did exactly that with the Lex Pompeia de Ambitu, which was designed specifically to correct the abuses that had wrecked the election for 53. However, there was a get-out-of-jail-free provision in that law, as was often the case in Rome. And I assume the logic of this was that you wanted to get at least some of the guilty parties if you couldn't get them all. And that provision is that any successful prosecutor who catches someone in the act of electoral bribery can be excused for their own crimes. Now, Memmius showed that he was not necessarily the most politically astute player because the person he chose to go after was Metellus Scipio, the consul of 52, so someone who was currently in office or had just been elected to office. And why that was a bad idea is precisely because Metellus Scipio was extremely well connected among all the Optimates, which was still ostensibly Memmius's political home. And Metellus Scipio was also the father-in-law of Pompey. So Pompey had just married Cornelia, his daughter. And this meant that Memmius had arrayed a formidable group of people against him by taking Metellus Scipio to court. And in terms of this defense, it appears that Metellus Scipio was almost certainly guilty. He was not necessarily what we'd call an ethical man. But Memmius was also deeply hated. And Pompey decided to go all out to get his new father-in-law acquitted. And he actually appeared in court wearing mourning garb, saying that what was happening was outrageous and unfair and a blow to his family's happiness. And so Pompey, who was actually pretty good at playing the victim, got Metellus Scipio off, and once Metellus Scipio was acquitted, Memmius realized that he had really played his hand very poorly now for a couple years running, and it was time to get out of Dodge before things got even worse for him. But he had one last little side quest that he wanted to go on before he left Rome. A decade and a half earlier, Memmius had tried and failed to prosecute Marcus Lucullus, and as revenge for Marcus Lucullus successfully defending himself in court, Memmius had gone and seduced his wife, and that had created a personal scandal that Marcus Lucullus had to deal with. Well, it appears that Memmius's MO was to strike back in personal ways when his public attacks failed, and he decided to go right back to that playbook and do a repeat. This time his target was Pompey's new wife and Metellus Scipio's daughter, Cornelia. And Cornelia was a desirable woman by all accounts. She was apparently very attractive, and she would have been pretty young at the time. And so this was Memmius's greatest conquest, if he could get her. However, apparently she wasn't interested. Perhaps Memmius was not as handsome or charming as he was when he seduced Marcus Lucullus's wife. Either that, or she simply understood the politics of the whole thing and realized that Pompey was the most prestigious husband she could get, and if she jeopardized her marriage by having an affair with Memmius, then she would really be screwing over both her father and herself. And so, rather than meeting with Memmius, as so many women had done before, she instead turned over the correspondence that Memmius sent to her, the little love letters, to her husband, and Pompey, out of wrath, decided to banish the man, Nicias of Cos, who had facilitated these letters. So Memmius had found a middleman to try to set up this affair, and he was someone who owed a lot to both Pompey and Memmius. So he was sent home, and that might seem like it would be a major demotion to go from being in the trust of one of Rome's leading men to being sent home. But it actually kind of all worked out for Nicias, because later he'd be acknowledged as a semi-independent ruler on his home island. So, if anything, he won. So, someone left happy, even if certainly Memmius and Pompey were both greatly angered and distressed by the way that this attempted seduction went. Memmius's political aspirations were now thoroughly dashed. Yet he knew that there were still women to bed and poems to write, and so he went to a place where any good fan of Greek literature would go if they were wealthy and now without obligations. And that place, of course, is Athens. So Memmius decided to relocate to Athens, and he used his connection with the Epicurean school. Remember, he was a friend and former patron of Lucretius, the greatest Roman Epicurean, and he used his wealth and his connection with Lucretius to purchase Epicurus's old estate, which at this point was near ruins. And so he then tried to approach the Epicurean school to become kind of their de facto leader. He thought that he was well qualified. Of course, they disagreed. They had their own native traditions, and they didn't think that a Roman politician, especially one so controversial, was exactly a good representation of leading a good, quiet, honest life. And so he probably felt offended by their rebuff, and as a kind of petty revenge, since he wasn't interested in their wives, he decided that he was going to tear down Epicurus's home and rebuild something grander. But to do that, this site was historically protected by the city of Athens itself. So he had to go to the local government and request permission. Now, normally, if you're a Roman living in a place like Athens, you would just distribute money and get your way. But in this case, they decided to put their foot down. And they knew that eventually his pressure would take them out unless they had outside help. So among other people, they wrote to Cicero. And so Memmius, despite having left Rome, was now being flooded with letters from senators back in Rome who were begging him not to go forward with this. And when I say begging, at least Cicero was begging. I'm sure there were others who had harder feelings and were threatening him. So ultimately, he decided that the heat was a little bit too high, and he left. He decided to relocate somewhere else. We're not really sure exactly where. And it seems that he sold Lucretius, or excuse me, not Lucretius, but Epicurus's home to someone else who took better care of it. As for where he went, we actually have no idea. This is one of the mysteries of Memmius. We don't know where he went next. But here are some possible ideas. So, one of the most intriguing possibilities is that Memmius actually was recalled to Rome in 49. One of Caesar's first actions after he drove Pompey out of Italy was to follow the advice of his new supporter, Gaius Scribonius Curio the Younger, and recall all of the exiles from the 50s. And one of the major groups benefiting from this recall were the number of men who had been exiled based on Pompey's new bribery law, and also people who had been convicted of political violence. And so Memmius, who had entered voluntary exile to avoid that law, was someone who potentially could have benefited. We also know that Memmius at one point had a connection with Curio, since his sister had actually married Curio's father. It's possible that they were friendly, although we have no way to know that. It's also possible, of course, that Curio thought that Memmius was a fool, since he generally held a rather low opinion of most of his fellow senators. At any rate, he should have been legally covered by this, and yet we have no evidence he ever went back to Rome. In fact, we have no idea whatsoever what happened to him after he left Athens in 51. So, what are the likely possibilities? Well, the odds are good that he either got sick and died not long after leaving Athens and before the outbreak of the Civil War, so sometime in 50, or that once the war broke out, he decided to remain strictly neutral. After all, he hated and was mutually hated by literally every major figure in the conflict. His scandal had only been a few years earlier. A lot of people were still bearing the scars of it, and no one really stood to gain anything by association with someone like Gaius Memmius. So my suspicion is that he simply lived out his life somewhere in Greece, perhaps on one of the islands, and let his former foes fight his other former foes, while he just sat back and drank wine and wrote poems about women he was sleeping with. Or at least that's what I'd like to think. Of course, I have no idea. He might have just simply got sick and died. Although Gaius Memmius was a complete failure in the end, he was still an incredibly significant figure in Roman politics. He was, as I mentioned, probably the first person to not only call Caesar the Queen of Bithynia, but also the first to say that Caesar absolutely must be punished for what he did as consul in 59. And despite Memmius being embarrassed and largely made an outcast, his stance had become the standard talking point for the optimates. And later, once they sort of recruited Pompey into their ranks, this was one of the non-negotiables that eventually caused Pompey and Caesar to go to war. So Memmius's political stances, some 10 years after he first took them, were among the leading causes for Caesar's civil war. Not to mention that his scandal had really helped to fracture that relationship between Caesar and Pompey in the first place, because he had dealt with both in a disingenuous manner and made both of them feel foolish. He also put Pompey under a lot of pressure because Pompey was largely the one being harassed when the election wasn't held and Rome wasn't being run by senior officials. And so Pompey was the one forced to deal with the problem that Memmius created. And so that helped to build up that distrust. Now, it's also worth mentioning that when we think about factionalism in Rome, and we think about especially the optimates, it's worth mentioning that despite them, in theory, seeming like this very concrete, solid block of men who had very firm, clear views, the fact of the matter is they were just as flexible and their membership was just as fluid as a lot of other groups in Roman politics. And so aside from some men whose loyalties never wavered, say Cato, most of these guys were kind of mercenary in their affiliation, and Gaius Memmius helps to really clarify that. Not only that, but it appears that at one point he was one of their leading lights, one of their future superstars, one of their rising stars, one of their more prominent voices. And so that's something that obviously they would not really want to have remembered, but it's still true. Memmius was a guy that they actually followed for a bit. So they need to confess to the allegiance they once held to this man. And it's also worth mentioning that Memmius's scandal helped to really facilitate the rise of Cato and also Metellus Scipio. One of the people he really weakened, Domitius Ahenobarbus, who of course accepted his bribe, he was one of the leading consuls at the time, he was actually a man who was in a great position to be the head of the optimates. He was someone who had a lot of energy and ability. He was, up to that point, seen as a just person. And being implicated with Memmius really screwed up his trajectory to the point where he just became another legate for Pompey in the Civil War, rather than the figure he could have been. We also, of course, mentioned that Memmius was a major backer of Lucretius, the most significant Roman philosopher of all time, and arguably the most significant Epicurean aside from Epicurus himself. And Memmius also apparently was not a big fan of historical preservation, as he nearly desecrated a site that the Athenians held to be the birthplace of one of their schools of philosophy. In the final analysis, I see Memmius as kind of the G. Gordon Liddy, or if we're being especially generous, the E. Howard Hunt of his time. The difference between the two, of course, is that Memmius was not capable of loyalty, whereas G. Gordon Liddy was loyalty personified. In fact, there are some dogs who felt that G. Gordon Liddy's level of loyalty was embarrassing because it was just that slavish. But both of them were prone to outlandish and ridiculous schemes that were well beyond their capacity to actually pull off. Both of them got caught and embarrassed, and yet both of them tried to continue on as if they were still productive members of society. I guess G. Gordon Liddy had a little bit better time of it with his radio show, but still, at least he had some friends left because of that aforementioned loyalty. The one advantage Memmius had over G. Gordon Liddy, of course, is that Memmius clearly had the ability to seduce women, whereas G. Gordon Liddy probably never had a sexual encounter that was not initiated at an ATM machine. So, those are my thoughts on Gaius Memmius. Next time, we'll look at yet more Romans of renown. Obviously, things can only go up from Gaius Memmius, so the next person we look at, I have no doubt, will be someone a bit more dignified and in line with what Rome wanted out of their leaders rather than what they ended up often getting.